The hum of the filter was the only sound on David's quiet summer afternoon, a low rhythmic pulse of perfection. Then a shriek shattered the air, followed by a thunderous splash that sent a wave of icy water over the deck. He stood at the window, watching the little tyrant claim his sanctuary, a cold rage building in his chest. And as the entitled mother smiled, a single decisive thought formed in his mind. He wasn't going to call the cops. He wasn't going to argue. He was just going to pull the plug. The pool was his cathedral. It was more than just a body of water shimmering under the relentless Arizona sun. It was David's retreat, his triumph, the one thing he had built with his own 2 hands that offered genuine, unadulterated peace. For 6 months he had poured his weekends into it, mixing cement for the foundation, meticulously laying each tile with a kind of prayerful focus, and finally, filling it with water that reflected the impossibly blue sky. The gentle hum of the filtration system was a constant, low-frequency mantra that soothed his soul. On a Tuesday afternoon, after a particularly grueling 8-hour stretch of coding that had left his eyes burning and his mind feeling like a sieve, he stepped outside, a tall glass of iced tea in hand. The heat was a living thing, a heavy blanket that draped itself over the valley, and the sight of the pool, perfectly still and inviting, was a balm. He was about to ease into the cool embrace when a sound, a high-pitched, piercing laugh, sliced through the air. He froze, his bare foot hovering just above the edge of the first step. The sound came from the next-door neighbor's yard, a family that had moved in just last month. David hadn't had much interaction with them, just a brief wave in the driveway to the mother, Brenda, a woman with a perfectly coiffed blonde bob and a perpetually strained smile. The son, a boy who looked no older than 8 or 9, was a whirlwind of frantic energy. Another laugh, closer this time, and then the impossible happened. A small, blurry figure in neon green shorts hurtled over his 6-foot privacy fence with a grace that was both horrifying and athletic. He landed with a sloppy, cannonballing splash that sent a plume of water geysering out of the pool and onto David's deck, soaking the patio furniture he had just wiped down. The boy surfaced, shaking his head like a dog, droplets of water flying everywhere. He saw David standing statue still, his iced tea now forgotten. The boy's face, a freckled, defiant mask, didn't register surprise. Instead, he grinned, a bold, toothy smile, as if he had just discovered a secret playground. "Hey!" David's voice came out sharper than he intended. The word a raw exhalation of shock and disbelief. The boy's name, David had learned from a brief, one-sided conversation with Brenda, was Liam. Liam ignored the shout and began paddling around the deep end, humming a tuneless song to himself. It was a bizarre, almost surreal scene. David's mind scrambled to find a precedent, a logical response. You don't yell at a child who has just trespassed into your private space and defiled your personal sanctuary. You go to the parent. He retreated back inside, grabbed a shirt, and stomped out his front door. He walked the 50 feet down his driveway, the heat radiating from the asphalt, and crossed over to Brenda's lawn. The front door was ajar, and he could hear the tinny sound of a reality TV show. He knocked, a measured, polite rhythm. Brenda appeared, her smile still in place, but with a slight tightness around her eyes. "Oh, David, hello! What a lovely surprise." David forced a smile that felt brittle. "Brenda, I'm sorry to bother you, but, well, I think Liam just jumped over my fence and is in my pool." Brenda's smile didn't falter. "Oh, is he?" "The little adventurer. He's just so full of energy, you know." Her voice was saccharine, dripping with a condescending sweetness. "I've told him not to wander, but he just loves to explore." David's patience, a finite resource on the best of days, was already running thin. "Brenda, he's in my pool. My private pool. I built it." "It's not a public park." She chuckled, a light, dismissive sound. "Oh, David, don't be so dramatic. He's just a boy. I'm sure he's having a wonderful time. You should just come out and join him. It's so hot today, you should be happy someone is using it." The suggestion, the sheer audacity of it, hung in the air like a noxious gas. David felt his cheeks flush. "That's not the point. The point is, he can't just come into my yard without my permission." "It's trespassing." Brenda sighed, her smile finally dropping, replaced by a pinched expression of martyrdom. "Look, I'll talk to him. Just don't make a big deal about it, okay? It's just water. It's not like he's going to hurt anything." She gave him a final, curt nod and started to close the door. He stood there for a moment, mouth agape, the silence of the street feeling like a sudden, accusing presence. He had been dismissed. His sanctuary had been invaded, and the invader's parent was treating it as a cute, harmless anecdote. He went back inside, his plan for a relaxing afternoon now replaced with a simmering resentment. He watched from his window as Liam continued to splash, now pretending to be a whale, blowing spouts of water into the air. He stayed there for almost an hour until Brenda, with a sharp whistle from her back porch, called him inside. The next day, David decided to let it slide. He thought maybe Brenda would have a stern word with her son. He was wrong. The next day, the next, and the day after that, Liam was back. Sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend from the street. They didn't jump the fence anymore. They just climbed over it like it was a set of monkey bars. The once pristine water was now littered with plastic toys, and there was a constant high-decibel chatter that echoed into his quiet home. He tried a different approach. He waited until they were in the pool, then he walked outside, a neutral expression on his face. "Hey, guys," he said, trying to sound calm. "You need to get out. You can't be in my pool." The friend, a slightly older boy with a buzz cut, gave him a confused look. But Liam's mom said it was okay. David felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. "Well, it's not. This is my pool. It's private property." Liam, the self-appointed king of the watery domain, squinted up at him, his small face scrunched up in annoyance. "My mom said you're just being a big meanie." That was the line. The direct verbal assault, the gaslighting, the twisted logic that somehow made him the villain. He watched as they continued to swim, now more brazenly, and he knew a second confrontation with Brenda was inevitable. He walked back to her house, the anger a hot, throbbing thing in his veins. This time there was no polite knock. He rapped his knuckles sharply on the door. Brenda opened it, her face a mask of faux concern. "David, what on earth? You look so upset." Don't do that," he said, his voice low and strained. "Liam is back in my pool, and he told me that you told him it was okay. He's got a friend with him this time. This has to stop." She placed a hand on her hip, her voice rising in volume. "Oh, for goodness sake, David. It's a pool. What are the kids gonna do, drown your pool?" She laughed, a loud, artificial sound. "You need to relax. It's summer. Let the kids have fun." "You're being so selfish." "Selfish?" The word felt like a punch. "This is my home, my property. This is my right to privacy. You can't just give away access to my yard." She leaned forward, her face contorting with a fury that had been simmering beneath her sweet facade. "You know, this is ridiculous. It's an empty pool. What are you, some kind of hermit? You're being hostile, David. I should call the police on you for harassment." The threat, hollow as it was, landed with a sickening thud. He was the one being harassed, the one whose peace was being destroyed, and she was turning the tables, painting him as the aggressor. He took a step back, the fight draining from him, replaced by a cold, numbing clarity. Arguing was useless. Reason was a language she didn't speak. He walked away without another word, her voice still a buzzing in his ears. He got to his own front door, closed it, and locked it. He didn't go to the window. He didn't look at the pool. He walked straight through the house, out the back door, and over to the small gray box that housed the pool's brain. The pump was humming, a steady, contented whir, pushing water through the filter, keeping the liquid paradise clean. He reached for the breaker switch, his hand trembling slightly. This was the point of no return. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a decision. A grim, hard-won piece of justice. He took a deep breath, and with a silent prayer for all the moments of peace he had lost, he pushed the switch down. The low hum of the pump died instantly, replaced by a sudden, jarring silence. The filter, no longer working, fell silent. The jets at the far end of the pool stopped spraying water, and the surface, which had been in constant motion, fell into an unnatural stillness. He looked up, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he didn't hear the sound of splashing. He could only hear the sound of his own heavy breathing, and that's when Liam's small, confused voice carried across the yards. "Mom, what's happening? The pool isn't working anymore." The silence that followed the click of the breaker switch was deafening. It was a silence filled with a triumphant, cold satisfaction for David, and for Liam, a sudden, baffling void. From his back porch, David watched as the boy, bobbing in the center of the now still water, turned his head, a quizzical expression on his face. The tiny geysers that had been his jets, his partners in aquatic mischief, had vanished. The quiet hum that was the lifeblood of the pool was gone. "Mom, what's happening?" "The pool isn't working anymore." Liam's voice, small and confused, carried across the yards. From Brenda's back porch, David heard a new sound, a sharp, irritated sigh. "Oh, for goodness sake, honey, it's probably just a fuse or something. Go play somewhere else." Her voice was still laced with that feigned maternal sweetness, but David could hear the thin wire of annoyance running beneath it. He stayed at his window, a silent observer in the unfolding drama. Liam, after another moment of bewildered silence, hauled himself out of the pool. He didn't climb the fence. He went to the back gate, unlatched it, and trotted across the yard. David saw Brenda emerge onto her porch, her face now a tight knot of frustration. She looked from her son to David's backyard, her eyes narrowing as she saw the eerie, motionless surface of the water. This was no accident. This was David's statement. He waited. He didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, a furious, rapid-fire knocking rattled his front door. He took a deep breath, the cold satisfaction from moments before still chilling his veins, and walked to the door, his steps slow and deliberate. Brenda stood on his doorstep, her arms crossed, her face flushed with a rage that finally, blessedly, felt genuine. Her polished veneer was gone, replaced by the raw, unvarnished fury of a woman accustomed to getting her way. "What did you do?" she hissed, the words a low, venomous rumble. David met her gaze calmly. "I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I secured my property." "Secured your property?" she scoffed. "You shut off the pump." "Why? Are you that petty?" "The kids were just having fun." "They were trespassing," David stated, his voice flat. "After I asked you politely to keep them out, and after you politely told me that you didn't care. Now the pool is closed. For the rest of the summer. Or until you get a pool of your own." Brenda's jaw dropped. The audacity of it, the sheer finality, was something she clearly had not prepared for. "You can't do that!" "It's ridiculous. It's 90 degrees out here. You're going to let that water just sit there?" "It's my water," David said, a hint of steel entering his voice. "And my pool. And my problem? You don't have to worry about it. You can just go home and let Liam find somewhere else to explore." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that was somehow louder than her shouting. "You know, David, this isn't just about the kids. It's about community. You're being so selfish, so unneighborly. This is a quiet, family-friendly street. People talk. People notice when you do something like this." She let the veiled threat hang in the air, a final, desperate gambit. "Then people will notice that I have a right to my property," David countered, "just like you have a right to yours. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He began to close the door, but she put a hand up, pushing it back. "Wait! My son's toys are in there! I need to get them!" Her rage had been replaced by a new kind of entitlement, a kind of petulant, desperate begging. David looked her straight in the eye. "Then send him over tomorrow when he's not in the pool. I'll have the gate unlocked. But the pump is staying off." He gave her a hard stare, and then, with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb, he shut the door in her face. The rest of the week was an eerie silence. David worked from home, watching the pool from his window. The water, once a vibrant turquoise, was beginning to cloud. A milky film, a testament to the stagnation, was starting to form on the surface. He saw Brenda's silhouette in her backyard, pacing, staring at the pool, but she didn't try to confront him again. For the first day, he felt a righteous, vindicated joy. He had stood his ground. He had won. He had secured his peace. But as the days passed, a new anxiety began to creep in. The cloudy water was an eyesore. It was a visible reminder of the war he had started. The pristine, peaceful sanctuary was gone, replaced by a visual representation of the animosity between him and his neighbor. On Friday, 2 days after he had shut off the pump, the color of the water had shifted from cloudy blue to a pale, sickly green. The sunlight, once reflected in a sparkling kaleidoscope, now seemed to absorb into the swampy-looking liquid. He noticed an increase in the number of gnats buzzing around the surface. He saw Brenda's son, Liam, peeking through the slats in the fence, a bewildered, disappointed look on his face. The silence that had once been a victory now felt heavy, charged with a new kind of tension. He knew this was a waiting game. Brenda was surely plotting her next move. The lack of confrontation was more unsettling than the constant shouting matches. He was right. On Saturday, just as he was about to make his morning coffee, the doorbell rang. He opened it to find not Brenda, but a large, imposing man in a polo shirt with a company logo he didn't recognize. The man had a clipboard in his hand. "Good morning," the man said, his voice a low, professional monotone. "I'm with Aqua Solutions. Your neighbor, Mrs. Harrison, called us. She was concerned about the condition of your pool and requested an inspection." David felt a cold prickle of shock. The audacity. She was using a third party, a seemingly legitimate business, to try and force his hand. "An inspection? My pool is fine." She said the pump was off and the water was becoming unsanitary, the man said, a neutral expression on his face, but with a hint of something knowing in his eyes. He clearly knew this was a neighbor dispute. "We're just here to make sure there's no standing water that could become a breeding ground for mosquitoes. You know, a public health issue." David's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was a legal end run, a clever, cruel move designed to put him on the defensive. She had weaponized his inaction. "I appreciate your concern," David said, forcing the words out. "But my pump is off. There's no public health issue. It's not a swamp. It's just a pool with a turned-off pump. The water is perfectly safe. And I'm not authorizing an inspection." The man's eyebrows shot up slightly. "Well, I'll have to report that back to Mrs. Harrison. And the city health department if necessary." David felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The city health department? She was going to report him to the city. "There's nothing to report," he said, his voice strained. "The water is filtered. I have a cover for it. It's not stagnant." He was lying, and he knew it. The water was stagnant. "It was starting to get gross," the man shrugged. "Just doing my job, sir. Have a good day." He turned and walked away, clipboard in hand, and David watched him go, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Brenda's front door was closed, a single curtain twitching at the window. He knew she was watching, waiting for his reaction. He had won the first battle, but she had just escalated the war in a way he hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just the entitled mother. She was a cunning adversary who was using the system against him. He felt the cold, hard reality of the situation sink in. He could turn the pump on and the water would clear, but it would feel like a surrender. It would be an admission that she had won. But if he didn't, the city could come and fine him. Or, worse, deem his pool a health hazard and force him to drain it entirely. He was trapped between his pride and the threat of legal action. He had pulled the plug thinking it was a clean, final move. But he had just created a much bigger mess. He went to the window and looked out at his backyard, at the sick, pale green water. He had turned the pool into something to be ashamed of. A monument to a petty fight. He watched as Brenda emerged from her back door, a gardening tool in her hand. She knelt down next to a rose bush, a small, triumphant smile on her face. Her gaze, for a moment, met his across the yards, and the smile widened into a smirk, a silent, mocking acknowledgement of her victory. The smirk on Brenda's face, a venomous, silent taunt from across the yards, was a more potent blow than any shout. It was the confirmation that she wasn't just an entitled nuisance. She was a cunning adversary who had found his weakness and was exploiting it with cold, calculated precision. She had turned his victory, the quiet defiance of a turned-off pump, into a ticking time bomb. The Aqua Solutions man and his veiled threat of the health department weren't just a move on her part. They were a checkmate. David went inside, the knot of dread in his stomach twisting tighter. He stood by the kitchen island, staring at his phone, his mind racing. She had outmaneuvered him. He could turn the pump back on, let the chlorine do its work, and watch the water clear, but the cost would be his pride. It would be a silent, gut-wrenching admission of defeat. He had chosen peace over confrontation, and in doing so, had only started a war he was ill-equipped to fight. He looked out the window at the sickly green water, and a wave of disgust washed over him. The pool, his once glorious sanctuary, now looked like a festering wound on the perfect canvas of his backyard. It was a monument to his failure to control his own property, and the clock was ticking. The Aqua Solutions man wasn't just a tool for Brenda. He was a legitimate threat. Standing water in Arizona was no joke, and the fines could be astronomical. He had to act, but he couldn't surrender. His mind, trained for logical solutions to complex problems, began to churn. He couldn't fight her on her terms. He had to change the game. He had to be proactive. He picked up his phone and, after a quick search, found the number for the City of Phoenix Vector Control. He knew what he had to do, report himself. Get ahead of Brenda and control the narrative. Frame it as a responsible citizen being cautious, not as a homeowner with a problem. The woman on the phone, her voice flat and bored, listened to his sanitized account. I'm a new pool owner, and my pump broke down a few days ago. The water started to get a little green, and I wanted to be proactive about it. I'm worried about mosquitoes. He felt the lie slide off his tongue with practiced ease. It wasn't a lie, really. It was just a highly edited version of the truth. He was worried, just not in the way she thought. We appreciate you calling, sir, she said. We get a lot of these. We'll send an inspector out within 2 business days. Please be prepared to provide access. 2 business days. He hung up the phone, a hollow feeling in his stomach. He had bought himself some time, but he had also invited a city official into his yard. An official who wouldn't care about his war with Brenda. An official who would only see a potential public health hazard. The next day, Sunday, was a blur of frantic anxiety. He cleaned the deck, adjusted the patio furniture, and even meticulously pruned his rose bushes, as if a tidy yard could somehow offset the brewing swamp in the center of it all. He saw Liam peering through the fence a few times, a look of profound, childish disappointment on his face. The boy didn't try to climb over, though. The still, lifeless water was a deterrent in itself. Monday morning, just as the sun began to climb into the sky, a white city-issued sedan pulled up to his curb. A stern-faced woman in a uniform, a clipboard held tightly in her hand, walked up his driveway. This was it, the official Dom, the face of his consequence. Mr. David Collins? She asked, her voice a clipped professional monotone. I'm Inspector Evans. You called about the pool? Yes, David said, forcing a smile. Thank you for coming out so quickly. She gave a curt nod and followed him to the backyard, her eyes immediately going to the pool. He could see her mentally ticking off boxes on her clipboard. Her expression didn't change, but he felt a cold dread as she saw the green film on the surface. I have a new pump on order, David said, trying to fill the silence. Just waiting for it to come in. Inspector Evans didn't respond. She just walked around the perimeter of the pool, her gaze fixed on the water. She took out a small, portable tool and dipped it into the water, checking for larvae. Looks like you caught it just in time, she said finally, her voice still a professional drone. No mosquito larvae to report, but this water is a breeding ground for bacteria. You need to get this filter running or have a pool professional drain the water. I'm working on it, David said, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. As I said, I've got a new pump on the way. She raised an eyebrow, a slight disapproving gesture. The city requires that any standing water be properly treated or drained. If we come back in 48 hours and the water is still in this condition, we'll have to issue a notice of violation. That could result in fines, he nodded, his mouth dry. He had tried to be proactive, to get ahead of her, and all he had done was give her a hard deadline. He had backed himself into a corner. Brenda had won. She walked back to the gate, her footsteps firm and resolute. As she went, she paused, her eyes lingering on the 2 backyards. She looked from David's stagnant pool to Brenda's perfectly manicured lawn, a silent, all-knowing look passing over her face. David had the sinking feeling she had seen this play out 100 times before. She knew exactly what was happening. He went inside, and through his window, he saw Inspector Evans walk over to Brenda's house. She didn't knock. She just handed Brenda a piece of paper, which Brenda took with a triumphant, malicious smile. The inspector walked away without a word, and Brenda stood there, staring at the paper, then at David's house, a wide, victorious smile on her face. He had lost. He had tried to be the hero of his own story, the triumphant homeowner, but he was just the guy with the gross green pool, the victim of a cunning neighbor and his own stubbornness. He sank into his chair, the feeling of defeat washing over him. The peace he had so desperately craved was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing anxiety. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and now he was facing the consequences. But as he stared at the sickly green water, a new thought, cold and precise, began to form in his mind. He had tried to win the moral high ground. He had tried to be the good guy. He had tried to fight fire with a garden hose. And now he knew it was time to get some gasoline. The silence that followed David's calm pronouncement was thicker and more charged than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the weight of shattered illusions. Brenda's husband, Robert, a man David had always seen as a shadow to his wife's blinding light, stepped down from the porch, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked from David, calm and holding a manila folder, to his wife, whose face was a mask of dawning terror. "What is he talking about, Brenda?" Robert asked, his voice low and serious. It was the first time David had ever heard him speak, and the sound was startlingly normal, a stark contrast to the histrionics he had grown accustomed to. Brenda's composure, her carefully crafted armor of suburban perfection, was completely gone. "He's lying, Robert. He's trying to retaliate because I called the city about his disgusting pool," she shrieked, her voice cracking with fury and fear. David didn't need to say a word. He just opened the manila folder and held it out. Robert, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and concern, took a step forward. "Stay where you are, Robert," Brenda cried, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "Don't listen to him. It's all a trick." But it was too late. Robert, ignoring her command, took the folder from David's outstretched hand. He looked inside, and his face, once a picture of quiet confusion, hardened. He looked at the printed city ordinance, the zoning map, and the photos of the patio cover, all meticulously labeled and dated. He looked from the documents to the structure that was the source of his wife's humiliation. "Brenda, is this true?" he asked, his voice now a quiet, dangerous rumble. He wasn't speaking to David. He was speaking to his wife, the woman who had just landed them in a potentially massive legal and financial mess. Brenda, her eyes darting between her husband and David, seemed to deflate. The fight had left her. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her husband, knowing about her deceit and her petty cruelty, was more powerful than any confrontation with a neighbor. The perfect little world she had so carefully constructed was crumbling, brick by brick. I was going to handle it," she stammered, her voice small. "It was just a formality." "It's nothing." "Nothing?" Robert scoffed, his face pale with suppressed anger. "This is a clear violation. We could be looking at thousands of dollars in fines or even being forced to tear it down. And you knew about this? This is what you were doing instead of talking to the man like a human being?" He looked at David, a flash of apology in his eyes. David remained silent, a quiet observer. The fight was no longer his. He had handed the weapon to her husband, and Robert was now using it to tear down the walls of his wife's carefully constructed fortress of lies. Brenda, cornered, lashed out one last time. "You did this. You started this. You're a terrible person, a terrible neighbor." David finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "No, Brenda," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "I just finished it. You taught me the rules of the game, and now you're going to have to live with the consequences." As he spoke, a white city-issued sedan pulled up to the curb. David, Robert, and Brenda all turned to look. Inspector Evans, clipboard in hand, emerged from the car. She gave David a quick, professional nod, her eyes not lingering for a moment, and walked directly to Brenda's driveway. Brenda's face went white. She had been expecting the inspector to visit David's house again, to issue the violation notice she had been so sure she had won. She had no idea that David's call had already set this new, more devastating wheel in motion. Inspector Evans walked into the yard, her gaze fixed on the patio cover. She took out a small measuring tape and began to take measurements, her movements precise and deliberate. She looked up at the way the structure was attached to the house, then back at her clipboard. She didn't even need to speak. Her actions were a final, damning judgment. Brenda stood motionless, a silent figure of shame. Her triumphant smirk was gone, replaced by a dazed, horrified look. She looked at her husband, who was now standing next to David, his head shaking slowly in disbelief. She looked at her perfect backyard, the beautifully crafted patio cover that was now a monument to her deceit. The very thing she had been so proud of was about to be her downfall. David knew in that moment that he had won. Not because of a city ordinance or a fine, but because he had exposed the core of who she was to the one person she had tried so hard to deceive. He had not just pulled the plug on his pool, he had pulled the plug on her entire carefully constructed life. He walked past Robert and Brenda, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't say another word. He just walked to his own yard, took a key from his pocket, and went to the electrical panel. He flipped the switch. The breaker clicked, and with a soft, familiar hum, the pool pump whirred to life. He walked to the edge of the pool, the sound of the churning water a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. He looked at the sickly green color, but this time he wasn't filled with shame or anger. He was filled with a deep, peaceful satisfaction. The pump was on, and soon the water would be clear again. The chlorine would do its work. The green would fade. The pool would be a sanctuary once more. He looked up, and through the slats in his fence, he saw Liam, the boy who had started this whole thing, peeking through. Liam didn't look confused or disappointed. He looked happy. He looked at the pool pump, and he gave David a small, shy smile, a silent, wordless apology. David smiled back. It was a strange, beautiful moment of connection. He had started this war because of a petty squabble, but he had ended it by fighting for his right to a quiet, peaceful life. Brenda was left to deal with the consequences of her own actions, not because of what he had done, but because of who she was. The justice wasn't in the fine she would receive. The justice was in the fact that her perfect life was no longer perfect. It was in the fact that her husband knew her for what she was, and as the water in his pool began to circulate, the first subtle swirls of cleaner water already beginning to mix with the green, David knew that the peace he had been fighting for was finally, truly his. The water was still green, but in his mind it had never been clearer.